All right, everybody, welcome. Saturday night, Derby Day. I wish we could have watched the race today, but we're going to do our best to have some fun with some red wine. So welcome to all of you who are already on. Raise a toast in your honor. Thanks for being here. Looks like we've got about half the people. I'm sure we'll have some stragglers joining us shortly. We I think by shortly after 6, we had what looked like to be 100+ people. So we should have a full house tonight. So should be a lot of fun, like always. I want it to be interactive. So let's take a little sip real quick. Keep that right here. I'm not driving. So I want to say hello to everyone. Welcome to tonight's Jones is Thirsty virtual wine tasting. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Scott Jones. I'm very excited to have you here for our Anything But Cab tasting. My intel report tells me that we have a Maryland crew in the house tonight, which is pretty cool. I don't know how that happened or where that's coming from, but we've got a heavy representation from Maryland tonight. So welcome, everyone. I do want to, like always, give a quick rundown of what we'll do tonight. I hope everyone picked their new COVID destination gate. I saw that and kind of cracked up. But let me just quickly run down what we'll do tonight, and then we'll get started. So if you haven't already done so, please grab yourself a blank sheet of paper. It's not necessary, but it always is, part of the way we are looking at wine, as we like to be able to put it against a piece of white paper and kind of get a feel for the color, the brightness, and just you can tell a lot by the color of a wine. And then for those of you who were on your A game and wanted to participate in tonight's sensory exercises, you probably already have your lemon and salt and salami or chorizo or cheese or whatever. But if you haven't done that and you have easy access to it, just take a minute and grab some, because we're going to do an exercise with each one of the wines. And like we've done in past tastings, where we learn a little bit about how things like acidity, saltiness, fat in the presence of wine help us get a better idea of how we pair food and wine together. As always, if you have a question, feel free to take advantage of the group chat. You can also raise your hand. There's a button in the participants area where you can raise your hand, and I can see you in my participant screen and can unmute you, which is always cool. I did a wine event last night with about 80 or 90 people, and man, it was fantastic. We had a lot of great interactivity going, and I really hope that we can do that same tonight, because it really made the tasting just, it kind of elevates it, because I can sit and talk about wine all night, but it's really the conviviality and the fun sharing part of it is when everyone else gets involved. And then, like you see in all of my events tonight, the virtual tip jar is going to a terrific organization here in Birmingham called Open Hands, Overflowing Hearts. I've done a lot of work with them over the past few years through some auction items where we've done some wine dinners, and the work they're doing to fight childhood cancer is pretty wonderful. And actually, I think we have a special guest on the call tonight, so I may embarrass them for a minute and let them say a couple of words about what Open Hands and Overflowing Hearts is doing. But as always, the virtual tip jar is my Venmo account, which is Jones is Thirsty. So you can leave your tips there. And then this week, I added something a little bit new, because some of you have been doing this, but I felt like, well, why not just say it out loud? But tonight, you know, we've got this great interaction through Zoom, but obviously everyone's doing some cool things at their house. I've already had some snapshots of texts and pictures from folks that are telling me a little bit about what's going on in their patio or kitchen or wherever they are, they're set up. So if you take those and you post them to Instagram or Facebook, you know, you can tag me at Jones is Thirsty, the hashtag Jones is Thirsty, and I'd just be cool to see what everyone's doing. My family is on the Zoom on other computers, and they're always taking snapshots of the big grid, which I don't see. I'm in the speaker view, so they always send me after the events these really cool, it's like the Brady Bunch on steroids, or like a giant wine-filled Hollywood squares where I get to see all these people, but it's always neat to see what everyone's doing in their own homes. So let me stop there for one quick second, and let me just see. Okay, I see the Perry's on, and I'm gonna put them on the spot, and I'm gonna unmute them. Kristen, are you there?
I am. Hey, how are you?
Hey, listen. So I know this is totally unplanned, but I mean, you guys are like sitting there like you're getting ready to have your Christmas card made.
Right.
I have a quick backstory. You know that I also do work with the Hope for Autumn Foundation. They've been the recipient of a virtual tip jar, but several years ago, I did an auction event for the Hope for Autumn Foundation, and at the time, the Perry's daughter, Kayla, was one of the recipients of some of that goodwill from the Hope for Autumn Foundation when Kayla was still a student at Auburn. And what was really wild is, and the way things happen is, we had done this big event, and everybody's out. We were on top of the Crest building in downtown Birmingham, and everybody's out there having a good time. And I was just kind of talked out, and I just wanted some water, and I walked back in where the wine was, and the Perrys came around and asked for a little champagne, and you could just tell they were kind of wiped out from everything emotionally, just talking the whole deal. And we sat and had got to know each other a little bit over some champagne, and it was really special. And then Kayla went on to start her own pediatric cancer foundation. So I just wanted you guys maybe to say a few words about that, because it's important for, I think, everyone to know about that connection, or at least it is to me, because that's such a part of what we do. So I want to just kind of talk a little bit about what the primary objectives of the organization are.
Absolutely. So Kayla was diagnosed with a very rare pediatric cancer at the age of 18, which was exactly 7 years ago. Actually, this is the week of her diagnosis 7 years ago. So it's been a crazy week on top of everything else. However, Kayla turned 25 just a few months ago, and she's married. And she is married, and she is a miracle. She's not a child anymore. She's a miracle young adult. And so when she relapsed with neuroblastoma, she founded Open Hands Overflowing Hearts in an effort to raise funds for pediatric cancer research, just because pediatric cancer research is the least funded cancer of all the cancers that there are. And so over the last, we founded Open Hands Overflowing Hearts in 2014 and have raised almost $2 million for pediatric cancer research up until this point.
Fantastic.
So we are excited and proud of Kayla. Wish she could be here tonight, but it's her husband's 25th birthday. So,
she told me. It's like, yeah, we'll give you a pass on that. Your mom and dad can be there. Yeah, and they're in the middle of this virtual run right now too, right?
We just finished a run for their lives. We finished it on April the 30th. We had over 500 racers, runners, and we put in a whole lot of miles in April for pediatric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So well, I so appreciate y'all being here, and I love Kayla's energy, and I just, it's man, it's good stuff. So y'all relax. We'll have a good time, okay? And I appreciate you being such good sports.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we talked about some of the high level basics of what we're doing tonight. ABC, anything but cab. This came directly from your responses when I sent out the survey about what folks wanted to see. They wanted to know about red varietals that were anything other than cab. So that's how we arrived at anything but cab. Cabernet Sauvignon may be the world's most popular wine, but there are so many other delicious red wine options out there. So tonight we're going to dive into three of some of my favorite budget-friendly, food-friendly alternatives. So for those of you who get my newsletter, you know that I like to think of myself as the Obi-Wan Kenobi. So I'm here to explain a little bit about the grapes, the regions, the unique terroir of these regions. But ultimately, my goal is for us to have fun, for this to be a laid-back way for me to kind of teach and help you, get some confidence both in buying and enjoying, and kind of defeat that dark side of wine intimidation. So we've got three great wines. I hope you guys have already started enjoying them. If you haven't already opened them, please go ahead and do that. I sent out an email ahead. These wines are young. They can benefit from a little air. So I opened up mine about an hour early just to let them breathe a little bit. If you haven't, that's cool. But if you haven't, go ahead and to get that done. Also, we're gonna, as you know, we kind of taste them systematically. So best case, you have 3 glasses, so we can compare them together, and you can go back and kind of taste them side by side. But if you only have 1 glass, that's cool too. Will not diminish your fun. I do want to say this. I'm honored, and many of you who've seen this on social media, and you actually, saw me talk about this in the invite. I'm really honored and excited to have Shari Morano here tonight. And Shari is, she's a busy mom. She's a runner. She is an unapologetic Duke basketball fanatic. She also happens to be a master of wine. I don't know how many of you have hung around with masters of wine, but there are about 50 in America, and less than 400 of masters of wine worldwide. So this is a very rarefied group of wine professionals. I met Shari back in 2012. We were traveling with a group of wine writers and journalists and professionals down to Chile and Argentina. And so we were together over, it was about a week and a half. And we, just learned and explored those areas. But the thing was that, this group was a pretty heady group of wine professionals. The thing that struck me about Shari is that in spite of her incredible knowledge and expertise and the credentials, I never got the feeling that she allowed all of those attributes to define her. And if you've ever been around somebody that knows a lot about wine, they're enthusiastic and they want to tell you about it, but sometimes it can be a little overbearing. And that was one of the things that struck me, is that she never allowed those attributes to get in the way of her being incredibly gracious and very personable. There was never any games of this one-upmanship about I know more than you do, or I've been here more than you have. I mean, it was very, very cool. So we kind of bonded around running because we both enjoy running. But I have to just say that, kind of throughout the entire trip, despite my comparative novice status, if you will, she treated me no different than she treated one of the many superstar winemakers we met. And so in addition to her knowledge about wine, which is a gift, I think that ability to be a normal human being, despite all of that knowledge in her head, is also a gift. So Shari definitely embodies the Jones is thirsty, no snobbery philosophy. So I think, let me just see if Shari's on here. Shari, are you there? I just
I'm
wanted to
here.
say hello.
I'm here. Hi.
Hey,
Thank
hey.
you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so thrilled that you're here, and I'm going to embarrass you for a second because let me. I had to find this photo,
Oh
and
no.
you will appreciate this, or at least I hope you will appreciate it. But this was a shot of us at
Oh my
in
gosh.
Argentina, right at Renacer, and we were getting this amazing tour from Pato Reich, right? The
Yeah.
the son of the father who had started the winery, and Pato is very dashing. I mean, he's a really sharp dude. But we got this wonderful tour, and then over on the left side or the right side is following the tour. We had this amazing meal, and everywhere we went in Argentina and Chile, all of the meals were prepared over an open coal fire, just like that, just adjacent to the vineyards.
So much meat.
You remember that?
So much meat.
Yeah. Yeah, and it turns out I had no idea at the time, but it was a couple of years later that I actually posted this picture of this chef in a blog post that I did, and Pato replied to that and said, "This guy is like the underground rock star chef in all of Mendoza. Like everybody wants to hang out with him. Yeah, that he's really." He's a big deal, but of course he was very, very reserved. He didn't say a word. I don't think he spoke much English, but he is like the magician. And he was there, in a cast iron skillet, frying up those little empanadas. And then he had this little potato thing going. He had these coal roasted veggies. And then, like you said, Shari, everywhere we went, there was just that hunk of meat, whether it was beef or lamb. It was nuts. It's crazy.
So funny. That's great.
Yeah. Well,
I love it.
We're gonna tap into to your expertise tonight. So if you would just kind of stand by, we'll get to that. I think the first thing that I want to do though is we'll dive into the wines. Obviously, I want to go, and please be tasting. Don't wait on me or Shari, but be tasting. But I do want to quickly give a little overview of some of the regions that we'll be looking at tonight, just to provide some context. So that first wine that we'll taste tonight, at least in terms of, hopefully you've already tasted it, but the first one we'll look at is the Côte de Rhône, and it's the Perron family, and they are perhaps one of the more well-known families in the Southern Rhône. They are the owners of Chateau Beaucastel, and they make some fantastic wines out of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but they also make some really wonderful wines just from the Côte de Rhône AOC, and you can see right here the Côte de Rhône, and the Côte de Rhône village is comprises a fairly broad area, and then you can see the little area here that's Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And so the grapes from this wine that we're having tonight are in a little area that's just to the left of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but just to the right of the Rhône, the river there. So it's in that little cubby right in there. So it's kind of like Châteauneuf-du-Pape adjacent, if you will. I guess like when Deanna and I were living in LA, that would kind of be, I guess, like what a realtor would call Beverly Hills adjacent, maybe. I would imagine where you're not quite into Beverly Hills, but you're just on the edge, but yet, you still got, like a great place, and your parents visit and they're like, hey, this is great. You're right down the hill from Beverly Hills, and you're feeling pretty good about yourself because you're in a good, at least a good area. And that's kind of like what we're seeing here with this Côte de Rhône. the Orange community, and then you have Vensobra, which are two little communities that kind of where the vineyards are actually located, that these wines come from. And if you joined us a couple of weeks ago, we talked a lot about wines from the Rhone. You have the Rhone that's basically split into two sections. You have the northern Rhone, which is dominated by Syrah and Viognier, which is the white grape. That's where you have the very prestigious wines from Hermitage, and then like the white Viogniers from Condrieu and Chateaubriand. And then down in the south, which is a much larger area, is where kind of Grenache takes over, and Grenache is the driver there. And while several grapes are used in that blend, including Syrah, Grenache is really the primary grape there. And that's down here in the south is where you have the great wines from Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Gigondas. A lot of these wines that you've probably seen, but now hopefully you'll have some context in terms of where they come from. And the blend that we have tonight in this wine is about 60% Grenache, and then 20% Syrah, and then 20% of another grape called Mourvèdre. And those three grapes are kind of like peanut butter and jelly and bread, if you will. The three go very well together, and you see them blended often in that area. So that's what we're going to have tonight. The thing that we'll talk about when we taste the wine is this wine sees no oak. It's fermented and aged into 100% stainless steel. So that's kind of unique. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that you'll notice over here on the left, this is kind of a unique view of a vineyard from the southern Rhone. And you can see those that rocky river rock from the Rhone, and they're called the Le Galets is what they are, these river rocks, and they help to prevent soil erosion, and I think they also help retain heat, and so it helps these grapes ripen nice and slow, and you can also see that a lot of these vines are head trained. So if you've ever been to Napa and you see, a lot of the trellising that you see there, this is a much different way of training. And actually, when we get to talking about the Garnacha, maybe I'll have Shari give us a little bit of background on the hows and whys of when you would use head training versus another system of trellising. And then the next area we'll look at is Spain, and we looked at a cava on one of our first tastings that was up here a little bit closer to Barcelona, but we're still in a fairly cool region, and this is home to Garnacha. And while it's a very popular grape and an important grape in Syrah, I think many would agree that it really found its traditional home is here in Spain. And Aragon is the commune that we'll be looking at in terms of where the grapes are coming from. And then over in France, we have the AOC, which is their appellation classification. And then in Spain, we have the DO, and that Calatayud is the DO here, and you can see it on the map. It's this little area here, and then within that is the little town, which is where these grapes are sourced. And then finally, we're going to go to Washington, and I don't know how much y'all have know about Washington or have experienced those wines, but it's a pretty exciting place, and obviously I'm going to have I've got some questions for Shari relative to this region and the grapes that are grown there. So let's go back to the Rhone, and let's grab this wine if you already have it, and you have it, and let's give it a swirl. And
hey, we're swirling the Rhone.
And this is, you know, again, just for everyone, just for context, this is a wine that is has no oak, but you know, I guess, you know, to me, you know, I get that bright fruit, and you know, it's kind of, that's, you know, this has been out for about an hour, so I get you know, some spice and some clove, some berries, particularly red berries, and you know, it's a fairly young wine, so it's got that kind of racy acidity that is, you know, you would, to me, I would expect, because it hasn't had any time in oak to kind of soften any of that acidity. And I would add, you know, Shari, just from your experience, these kind of Rhone, these wines from the Southern Rhone that either have very limited oak or no oak. I mean, is that, I mean, I understand that, you know, Grenache sometimes sensitive around oak because of oxidation, but
oxidation, it can lose some color, it can lose some flavor. And you know, one of the things that's really great about Grenache is sort of that freshness and that really beautiful, almost sort of cherry liqueur kind of character. And I always think my mom used to make like red candy lollipops when we were kids. And to me, Grenache always has that sort of like candy cherry aroma and flavor. But not everybody, you know, everybody has different sort of frames of references when it comes to aromas and flavors and things like that. So you kind of have to have your own markers, but cherry is a common descriptor with Grenache. And then with Syrah, a lot of times one thing people will do is do, you know, older oak or stainless steel with the Grenache, and then add a little bit of oak component with the Syrah, because Syrah is a bit beefier, bit tougher, can handle that kind of aging process a little bit better than Grenache. But with the Syrah, a lot of times you get that black pepper character, and some
almost cracked black pepper.
And some berry fruit. And then usually Mourvedre brings kind of a little bit of an earthy character to the mix, but also good structure, a lot of tannin and some acidity to the blend as well. Sometimes Grenache can be a little bit soft in terms of acidity. So you would like, you get that from the Syrah and sometimes from the Mourvedre, the added structure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know how others are experiencing this, but I definitely can feel, my mouth is watering, so it's obviously that's got that lingering acidity, but I can just feel that light, you know, not super aggressive tannin, but I can feel that just on my, you know, top of my tongue. So, you know, with the acidity and with that tannin, that kind of, you know, kind of less assertive tannins, I think of this as like with, you know, something like chicken Parmesan that had a red tomato sauce. So you had like some acidity from the tomato sauce and some of the acidity here, and the, you know, just had that, you know, red and of the tomatoes, some of that natural sweetness that would kind of pair up nicely with a wine like this.
Yeah, it's a great food wine, especially because you don't have kind of that oak character that can sometimes dominate a wine, especially a young wine. It makes it a really good sort of food friendly. This is one I've served at barbecues as well. It goes really well with grilled meats.
Yeah, we talked about this. I guess it was 2 Friday nights ago. We did a tasting with Rhone Reds, and that was we spent a lot of time talking about those wines with like cracked pepper rubbed brisket with pulled pork. I mean, it's just, there's something about these wines from the Southern Rhone that to me really do link up nicely with a lot of Southern foods off the grill and off the smoker. They're real food friendly. Yeah.
Yeah. Unless
And,
it's sort of the North Carolina vinegar based barbecue.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. But that
It's
actually
totally
leads,
different pairing.
yeah. Well, that actually leads to that first sensory, exercise that I want to do, which is to have that little a bite of lemon, high acidity, and see what happens with it in the presence of this Côte de Rhône. So for those of you who have that, have the lemon, the first thing to do is to just take a swig of the Côte de Rhône, and then you'll kind of notice that acidity, because you'll kind of get it on the the sides here where your mouth will be watering. And then if you just kind of take a little lick of the lemon and then have a sip of the wine again, you can see that, well, what you should notice is that the wine kind of tastes and feels less acidic. And it kind of, to me, there's a certain richness that comes with the acidity dropping. I guess that's, Shari, might be what happens when you talk about a wine being flabby. I guess it doesn't have the right balance of acidity. It just feels, it doesn't have that zip. It's just kind of laying on my palate.
Flat.
But it definitely, I guess the thing to point out is that it definitely softens the acidity. And so when you're pairing food and wine, don't be afraid to have a wine with some acidity with a food that has some acidity, because while it would be a little bit counterintuitive, the truth is that they can actually complement each other versus, being something that looks like an absolute train wreck in your head.
Well, I think my favorite example of that too is how, and in some ways this is that one of those, pair like with like, or what grows together goes together. But Sangiovese and tomato sauce or pizza.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
high acid grape and with Sangiovese, and it's a great match with tomato sauce based dishes.
It's funny because I think you think about the bottle of Chianti and the thing of pasta. It's like you would never question that didn't make perfect sense. But if you stepped away from it and kind of put on your blinders and just thought about the principles of food and wine, you'd be like, that might be a clash for those really acidic tomatoes and that wine. But you're right, it just comes together. What anyone else have some thoughts they want to share about this Côte de Rhône? I know there's a couple of folks on this call in particular who may or may not remain nameless, but are big fans of Côte de Rhône wines, particularly from the South, have traveled there. So you might as well go ahead and share some thoughts about what you're drinking here. Otherwise, you could be called upon in a moment. So whether you want to raise your hand or put something out through the group chat, I really would love to hear what you guys think. Anyone? This to me is just like all these wines are a great weeknight wine that go with lots of different foods year round. And this family, they produce a lot of wines, right, Shari? I mean, this is a gigantic wine but this family also makes some very, very prestigious, well-respected, very high-end kind of benchmark wines from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and for those of you who are in Birmingham, what's really kind of interesting, whether or not you know it, is that Vineyard Brands, which is based here in Birmingham, actually has a little bit of a connection to this family, and if you go to the Vineyard Brands site, you see a lot of space devoted to Chateau Beaucastel, and looks like the Oglesbys have chimed in to say that Côte de Rhônes are their go-to weeknight reds. Something tells me that they're also the go-to weekend reds and lunchtime reds, but we'll leave it at that. Any other comments or anything? Yeah. All right. Well, we will, let's move on to the Garnacha. Yeah. I guess Shannon is saying that it's got a little bit of spice, that she's picking up some, oh, I see.
Mhm.
Perfect with barbecue pizza from Slice. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many of you are fans of barbecue pizza, but I'm shamelessly devoted to barbecue pizza, and this would be a great match for that. So the next wine that we'll talk about is this Garnacha, and this is again a very interesting wine in terms of its pedigree and its and just the way that this wine is put together. I mentioned earlier that, and I think what I might do just for discussion, because I would like Shari to say a couple of words about it, is let me share this quickly. Is to talk about the unique head-trained Grenache that comes from this region, because I think it might be new for most. I don't know that everyone's seen this. You certainly don't see it. You see it in some parts of in some of the California wine regions, but it's not. Yeah, that's right, in Zinfandel, because those vines can be 50, 60, 70, 100 years old, right? So this Grenache comes from vines that are very old, and by old I mean 80 to 100 years. So Shari, I would ask you, is that unique to this type of training? This kind of stumpier, low to the ground, where you've got this kind of short, firm base. I mean,
it's a great, it works really well in areas that can be very hot, and it's a great way of growing vines that in areas that can be prone to drought.
Okay.
And so you find that a lot in some of the hotter areas. So if you think about it, in parts of Spain, these are areas that can get pretty heated.
Yeah.
But also with older vines like this, you go through cycles. We've seen this in parts of the country, so parts of Spain, parts of France. If you think about some of the older vines in California,
Yeah.
a lot of times these can be vines or types of grapes that kind of lose favor and kind of get ignored from time to time, and
Mm-hmm.
you end up with sort of these really kind of old, gnarly vines that almost in some places in the south of France and in parts of Spain, people have kind of gone in and rescued.
Yeah.
And so you have some areas where you have that intersection between practicality and tradition. So you have areas that have kind of more money, and they have the neatly trained vines, and they have people who can go in and work the vines and train the vines. And then you have older areas that are not as wealthy. So some of the areas down in the south of France or Spain, where your labor sources are very different, and you don't have the availability of training materials and things like that. And so it's a really interesting thing sometimes, that sort of that aspect of what's practical for a vine, what makes sense in a region, drought, stress, heat, the type of grape, and then what sort of happens when things get left to themselves, and then also what makes sense in terms of how can we easily farm this so that there are fewer people who are working in the vineyard, or we don't have a lot of people picking. So what's easy to get to, and a lot of these areas also you don't have mechanical harvesters, and so if you think about that, areas where vines are set on wires and even movable wires, a lot of times there's much more mechanization there. In an area like this where you've got really old vines, you don't have that.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
one of those really wonderful, kind of fascinating things about wine, where there are lots of different reasons that can be everything from super practical to it's just tradition, or it's because there was nobody out there to actually take care of these for a really long time.
Yeah, yeah, and two observations that I want to ask. But first, we have a question that just came in through the group chat. Uh, from your perspective, Shari, what's the ideal temperature for this Grenache to be served, and then going back to the Côte de Rhône?
Yeah.
We always talk about cellar temperature. I opened up my wines about an hour ahead. They're nice and cool, but what's the best temperature to enjoy these wines?
So we generally say we serve our reds too warm and our whites too cold. So if you think about it, a white wine that comes right out of the fridge is actually usually, and I do like sometimes there are certain grape varieties that you really want like a cold glass with Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, or
Right.
Riesling. Like you really like that bracing both temperature and sometimes the aromas and the flavors. You really want that sort of sensation. But in general, a lot of white wines benefit from being taken out of the fridge for maybe 10-15 minutes before you're going to open them and drink them. Yep. Because that gives the aromas and flavors a little bit more time to come out if it's a more subdued grape variety. And then with reds, I have part of why we ended up buying the house here in North Carolina that we ended up buying years ago was that I don't know about where you guys are, but basements are not common in North Carolina.
Correct.
And so we actually have a house that's kind of built into a hillside. So we do have a basement. It's like a half a basement, but we have a basement. And so I have a wine cellar in the basement. And that was a really big thing for me to be able to have a space, dedicated space for my wine, to be able to keep it really, really cold. And so I generally, my cellar temperature is about 55 degrees. And so I will take it out, a little bit before we serve it. But I generally like my reds on the cooler side.
Yeah, yeah. And so Stephen had asked that question. I would agree.
Great
In fact,
question.
I've used that your cold example many times, Shari. And one of the kind of practical examples as I give is when you make a pasta salad or a potato salad and you serve it cold, you got to end up adding more salt and more seasoning because that cold can mute the flavors.
Yep.
And so you have to work hard to elevate the flavors, and that happens with these wines. And some folks have heard this until they're sick of hearing it, but and I won't disparage Mississippi, but let's just say you go to a wedding in the summertime and it's super hot outside, and you come out of the wedding, you go to the reception in the bar, and the wines are ice cold. You pour it in your glass, and the wine is so cold that there's condensation that forms on the glass. Well, you don't taste much at that point other than like acidulated water. I mean, it's refreshing, but you don't taste a whole lot. But if you were to let that glass of wine sit there and kind of warm up a little bit, suddenly the aromas come to life, and the kind of fruity qualities of those white wines kind of comes to life, and the wine can taste 180 degrees different than it did when you started as the cold, the super cold glass. Once it's kind of come to room temperature, it can be a completely different wine and an amazing experience.
Right. And actually, that's one of the things that I kind of enjoy sometimes with wine, when, especially reds, is when you open it up and you have that experience of it being on the cooler side, and then over dinner, over the course of a couple hours, it's evolving in the glass, and you're having this sort of different experience with the wine throughout your meal. I actually find that the first glass and the last glass are frequently different, but I find that whole process really fascinating.
And it's so cool. And we actually experienced this last night, where some of the wines had been out for 3 or 4 hours, and were tasting totally different than when we first started the tasting. It's a neat exercise. Now about this Garnacha, obviously this is from a region that knows this grape well. What I was going to mention, and it goes back to your point about just the uniquenesses of these various viticultural areas, is that this wine is actually part of a commune of several hundred growers that have been doing this for a few decades now, and so this is a collect of grape growers, if you will, that pull these Grenache grapes together to produce this wine. But I did want to say that I'm looking at the group comments right now, and Shannon, you have one of the best descriptors that I've seen in all of these virtual tastings that we've been doing, where people can submit comments, because I know exactly what you're saying. Shannon said that this wine, tastes fuzzier, and it's it's a great descriptor, because what's interesting, and Shari, we'll talk about this, is that it's warmer here. It's warmer than where we were in the Rhone. You're at 41 degrees north latitude, so it's down there. But this wine also gets a little bit of oak, so it just is going to feel, you get a little more tannin to me, and a little bit rounder on the palate. But I love that descriptor of fuzzier. That's awesome. Anyone else have a description that they want to share, that they wouldn't mind either passing along in the comments, or raising their hand? I'm happy to unmute you and have you talk about whatever you're experiencing. But while folks are sending some comments through, let's take give this wine a swirl, and just the aromas alone, to me, it's already something different than where we just were, even though this grape is, this wine is all Grenache. You've got, primarily a similar grape, but gee whiz, what a warmer region, what it does, different winemaking style. To me, it's just like it's just a kind of explodes in a way that to me, in terms of the aroma of the Côte de Rhône, is just not, a little bit more reserved. This one's starting to really, there's just tons of stuff coming off of it. And yeah, you're right, Susan. This with some aged cheddar is dynamite, dynamite. So everybody take a swig, your 100th swig of this one.
I also think the influence of a little bit of the combination of the French and the American oak on this is also going to lend something a little bit different here. That's always an interesting thing, is the use of different types of oak, French oak versus American oak. And you guys have, I'm sure you've talked about that from time to time, but just the use of American oak is fairly traditional in Spain, interestingly enough. And a lot of times you can find that on traditional Rioja, for instance. I love, they're
pretty dogmatic about the American oak, right? That's like,
it's really interesting, because you see a lot of new wave Spanish producers using more French oak, and so American oak tends to, you have more traditional Rioja producers doing the American oak now, but then you also find a lot of people using a combination. And American oak has really, it used to be significantly cheaper, which was one reason why you had a lot of people in Spain using it. But it's much better in quality now than it used to be, and the character that it can give a wine can be really different, so that a lot of people want to use both, because it can bring, each type of oak brings something different to the table. But as a blind taster, when you're faced with a tasting exam, a traditionally made Rioja is a gift from heaven, because American oak can typically have this aroma of dill or coconut to it. And so when you get that on a wine, you're like, yes, that's a banker right there. That's Rioja. So that's always a gift.
So from French, are you getting more of that vanilla influence, and then the more tropical notes from the American oak?
More
and
sort of
dill
vanilla.
as well. I'll put that away in my memory bank.
Vanilla, baking spice, cinnamon, toast, that kind of thing. But the toast level, depending on how heavily the oak itself is toasted, that will influence that kind of degree. But a lot of times that sort of dill coconut aroma flavor is that's your American oak trigger right there.
Yeah, well, we're definitely seeing some comments about um, the tannins being more pronounced in this one. And in fact, Kelly had asked if the increase in tannins was maybe because of the hotter, somewhat hotter climate, so maybe there's more ripening, or as the grapes ripen, not only are they having more sugar, but maybe the tannins are more developed. I mean, is there a connection between that, Sherry? Maybe the warmer climate and some of the tannins that would be in here, or is that part of the oak aging? And
I think oak is definitely contributing to this. And then I think also you've just got a much fuller, bigger bodied wine in your mouth overall. And I'm pretty sure that the alcohol on this is much
it's
higher
14
than
and a half.
higher than the Padron.
Yeah, it's serious. This is I mean, to me it's balanced enough that I don't really I don't feel the heat, because to me it's real juicy. I mean, I'm getting, it's definitely to me a pretty balanced, but you can definitely if you look at the back of the bottle, this one is no joke. For sure, in terms of alcohol. But on this one, I don't know what others are getting. I mean, Nadine was saying that she's getting some earthy quality on this, which I guess could maybe be some of that more rustic feel of where they are, that soil, the terroir there in Spain. To me, I'm getting like some licorice, or I just think of licorice, like black Twizzler sticks, the licorice sticks, and then that kind of that still that juicy blackberry kind of fruit, and it's this to me is really a delicious wine. I like Grenache a lot. I think it's a real food-friendly wine, and I mean, I don't know what your opinion is in terms of what you think the value of Grenache is from Spain, but I feel like, I mean, seems like a dynamite wine for the value.
This is a great, I mean, this is a great value, really excellent wine to buy. That's a really interesting question. Would you say it is a dry wine? I don't know if I can find so most red wines, a large portion of them you would consider dry. I mean, technically anything under a certain residual sugar level, you're going to consider dry. So most wines, technically speaking, would be classified as dry. Probably wouldn't surprise me if this is not zero in terms of grams per liter residual sugar, but I don't know. Let me see if I can look it up and find residual sugar.
I think, when in some of these wines that come from these warmer regions, they're kind of constantly chasing their tail between when it's exactly the right time to pick, because they want enough sugar to be able to ferment it all the way through and get that right level of alcohol, but not so much so that I mean, it can't be like white lightning, so there's that balance of making sure that it's through the fermentation process that most of that sugar that is fermented out, and they've got that 14.5% alcohol.
This one is 2.3 grams per liter. So technically speaking, a dry wine.
Yeah.
But it does have a touch of residual sugar to it, but not, you would still classify it as a dry wine. The thing that's always tricky with wine is that it smells so much of fruit. And when you smell that fruitiness, you think it's sweet, but there's a difference between sweetness and residual sugar and smelling fruity. So one of the ways that you can actually sort of check, believe it or not, is to hold your nose while you're tasting your wine.
Really?
Not easy to do.
That's
but
right.
if you think about it, it's like having a cold, right? And when you've got a cold, you can't taste anything. So much of tasting is actually smelling. So if you cut that off while you're tasting, you are actually not, I see people trying it. That's great.
Yes.
just don't choke or anything. But it totally changes your experience with the wine. And you will, if you're not smelling it while you're tasting it, it will change your perception of
Yeah.
the fruitiness and the sweetness.
Yeah, that's great. I am going to absolutely rip that off because you're right. And we talk about this, you know, in almost every wine tasting, whether it's in person or these virtual. When we start to taste, you know, I'm always telling folks that, you know, it's so much about, you know, all of it happens in that little bundle of nerves right there. And so it's got to get up there. And you're right. When you've got the, not hopefully not the bad kind of flu, but when you've got a stuffy nose, you can't taste anything. And that tells you exactly what's going on right there. One comment I'm seeing right now that I just think is phenomenal is the Perry said they accidentally bought some spicy olives. And they said that the spicy olives and the Garnacha are dynamite. So that would make sense.
Some
Some of those
sausage.
the spicy, you know, kind of a brine of the olives and especially, if you've got some chorizo. And I guess the other thing, Shari, that would be, that's probably worth noting as it relates to chorizo, which can have some of that spicier paprika in there, is that while the tannins are definitely more pronounced on this wine, I mean, I think they're still fairly soft, but they're definitely there. It's not enough to dial up the heat so much, where like a wine that has big assertive tannins and pepper spice can, you know, accentuate the feeling of the spice. This is kind of right in the middle there. It's like a really perfect combination of tannin, fruit, and heft to go with the chorizo and then those briny olives. So it sounds like.
And it makes sense too if you think about Spanish cuisine and tapas and little plates like that. And again, meat, olives, cured meat, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Now I'm getting hungry again. I've already eaten dinner, but I'm getting hungry again.
I know, it happens every time. I mean, it's like, it's the beauty, and that's what makes these things so special. They just go so well together. All right, well, let's bump over to the Velvet Devil, the Merlot, you know, there's a lot to talk about just in terms of the grapes, the region.
I think you could even talk about the packaging here and the name of the wine.
Yeah.
And just, I think, you know, that's where Charles Smith has done a really, done a great job and done a clever job with really eye-catching labels and things like that. And, you know, that's actually a question I get a lot is, you know, is it okay to buy a wine by a label if you find the label attractive or something? And I mean, I do it all the time. I mean, I can't possibly know every wine and from every place and every producer and every grape. And frequently, I mean, I love to try different wines, different things. And wine stores for me are like right up there with sort of bookstores or shoe stores. I can spend hours and I rarely leave empty-handed. But I'm always looking for different things to try. And sometimes it's a matter of something that catches your eye. So I'm always paying attention to how somebody is packaging their wine, because packaging tells a story. It matters.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I in all honesty, there's not a time that goes by, whether I'm in a grocery store or whether I'm in a Costco or a wine store, every time I see Kung Fu Girl, I stop and I look at that bottle and I think, I want to be that person when I grow up. I want to be smart, a smart winemaker, but clever enough to like have some fun with it.
Right.
So, I mean, you're right. That whole Charles Smith line of wines, and I'm telling you, they're fantastic wines. That Chateau Smith cab that he does, or you know, he's since sold the company, but they're still great wines. This Velvet Devil, the Kung Fu Girl, they're terrific wines. They really are. But yeah, the packaging of this one is a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Now, I think there's somebody who's just posted, said, I don't know if she's joking or not. She said she will not drink Merlot.
She must have seen Sideways. I'm sorry. Well, all I can say to that is last night I had the pleasure of doing a an extensive virtual wine tasting on Bordeaux
Oh,
with
that's great.
a wine shop here in Birmingham, and the owner of that wine shop is a Bordeaux collector. He took
Right.
the left bank, which is mostly Cabernet. I got the right bank, and which is primarily Merlot and Cab Franc. And man,
Mm.
some of those Merlot wines from Pomerol and Saint Emilion were just fantastic. We had one from Castillon with it that butts up right to Saint Emilion, and it was. I mean, these wines were phenomenal. So if you have a bad taste in your mouth about Merlot, you just kind of need to go to the right place
Yes.
and know that it's grown in a region that's made for Merlot and not just shoehorned in there because it needs to be grown, because Merlot can be a terrific grape. It really can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and in many ways, the name of this wine is really appropriate for Merlot. Merlot
Yeah.
has a velvetyness, a texture, a plushness to it that Cab does not have. I'm a huge
That's
Cabernet
right.
fan. I love Cabernet. I love the structure of Cabernet and the firm tannins and the acidity. But you also, when you look at Bordeaux, you realize why a blend is so popular, because they each bring something to the table, and Merlot really truly does have a plushness and a generosity that Cabernet does not. And when you have the right winemaker too, you can have just such a beautiful expression of Merlot on its own as well, that it can stand up, can be by itself. But with Cab Franc and Cabernet too, I love that combination. But Merlot absolutely has gotten a bad rap since Sideways. It's crazy to me. It's
Which is,
you see it in the numbers.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it really is. It's funny what pop culture can do to an entire industry, because that category has just had its legs taken out from underneath it, and it may never. I mean, in terms of most wine consumers, it's taken a hit that is not deserved. And Nadine, I see your husband. I mean, I see your comments here, and you can go ahead and put some manacles on his hands right now and keep him away from the laptop, because he's just poisoning your mind. And so, Nadine, has he had a sip of the Velvet Devil? Please respond. Don't let him respond. And I hope everyone else will take a big giant sip of it now too. Because it is, it really does. It has that silkiness to it. And I mean, the tannins are there, definitely, for sure. I mean, they're sticking around a while in a way that their Grenache and the Côte d'Aron did not. I mean, this is a bigger wine for sure, but there's still that silky smoothness to it that is just, it's good by the glass. And the other ones are great by the glass. This is good by the glass, but it would also be, I mean, I can just think of all the foods that this would be really wonderful with, whether it was a ribeye off the grill, or something a little bit heartier that was roasted. I mean, it's a roasted pork loin. I mean, this just seems like a really food friendly wine to me, but a great good porch wine too. That after work.
Yep, Merlot is a pretty versatile grape. I do. Some of the numbers indicate that it's starting to kind of grow a little bit more in popularity, that being sort of rediscovered. And I think Washington State overall does a really nice job with a variety of grapes, but the red grapes in particular, Syrah and Cabernet and Merlot, I think really thrive in Washington.
Yeah, and we'll actually, we're going to do a little Q&A in a few minutes for those that want to stick around. But that's actually a question I want to ask about. But for those of you who don't know about Washington, you need to know that a few things. First, if you don't know Washington, you're missing out on some great values and some great wines. They're the second largest producer of wines in America, behind California. And if you've been to Seattle, that's not wine country, though there are some wineries north of that. But what happens is the Cascades run down from British Columbia, all the way down through Oregon, frankly, and all to kind of Northern California. But the Cascades create what's called a rain shadow. And so what happens is that the land to the east of the Cascade Mountains is not necessarily affected. And in fact, whatever you think about, dry, dreary, cold Seattle that's close to the Pacific, it's dry out there, and it's lots of sunshine. And in fact, relative to where we just were in Spain, on a latitude standpoint, it's actually a little bit further north in latitude than even where we were with that Garnacha. So it's a little bit cooler there. But the Columbia River Valley is a huge place where they produce a lot of wines. These wines are sourced from 2 smaller AVAs that are inside that larger Columbia Valley AVA. There's Ancient Lakes, which is relatively new in terms of Washington AVAs. And then Walluk Slope, which is a pretty well-known AVA where a lot of grapes are grown that are provided back to some of those big wineries. But it's kind of like like a kind of a Lodi of Washington, maybe, where a lot of grapes are grown and then make their way into other wines from other regions. But it's hot summers, cold winters, real dry. Luckily, the Columbia River gets a lot of that runoff from the Cascades, so it's nice, cool water that fills the water table there, so they're able to irrigate when they need to. But this is just a really fun, drinkable, to me, very, just a delicious example of a Merlot.
Yep. Yeah, it's a super interesting area. And then there are also so one of the big things that they're doing in Washington right now too is really doing a lot of soil analysis and working on their different AVAs. They're still exploring the area. There's the Rocks District. And as you get close to that border between Washington and Oregon, there actually are AVAs that cross over, which is really fascinating to think about, that crossover over state lines. It's kind of like how Carneros crosses over Napa and Sonoma, but it's a little trickier because it's 2 states. So it's fascinating to me. But Walla Walla makes some amazing Syrahs coming out of there. And then I brought a bottle up with me that I was going to show, because I think there are a lot of smaller growers in Washington that people just don't know about. So I'll show this bottle. This is one of my favorites. It's called Cadence. And this is a great story. This is a guy who was an engineer at Boeing. And his wife was a lawyer, and they started doing home winery competitions because Boeing had a group, and he started winning and started making a lot of wines, and then gave up his day job, and his wife kept working, and then eventually they launched their own winery. And I've been following them since kind of the early times when they started, so back beginning of 2000. And they source a lot of their grapes. They do a lot of Cab Franc based wines, and they get a lot of stuff from Red Mountain, which I think is also a fabulous AVA. So I was just going to give a shout out to Cabernet Franc from Washington as well, and some small producers from there as well.
Yeah, Cab Franc, again, if you watch Sideways, the wine he wanted was that Cheval Blanc, which is with mostly Cab Franc. So don't let the detractors be disparaging Merlot and Cabernet Franc. So real quickly, we've got a number of questions here that we want to get to, but I also want to be sensitive to everyone's time. For those of you who have to who need to leave, please do. I can't thank you enough for joining tonight. But for those of you who can stick around, we're going to have a Q&A with Shari and really pick her brain on some really cool wine things. I just want to remind everyone that we've got a few more virtual wine tastings already lined up, even more after that. But in 2 weeks, we've got everything's coming up, rosés. After that, we have the Desperately Seeking Chardonnay. And then after that, we have Off the Beaten Glass, where we're actually going to talk about a few of the South American red wines that Shari and I had a chance to explore when we were down there. And then also, just want to remind you, everyone, that virtual tip jar tonight, Jones is Thirsty. And thank you all for being a part of it. And then for those of you who want to stick around, we'll jump into some questions for Shari, where we can it's like stump the master of wine now, right?
No, it's a Saturday night.
one of the things that comes up every single time I do a tasting, whether it's online or in person, but I've never had the chance to get the expert opinion on that. Screw top versus cork. I mean, what gives?
Okay, so this is a fascinating topic.
You're blushing. I can see it already. You're blushing.
I love it.
So don't worry.
So okay, so first off, let me say that I think that there is a role for multiple closures in this world. If you think about it, the glass package, the glass wine bottle, and the cork, this goes back to, it really hasn't changed since sort of the 1800s. And in many ways, to not have development and evolution in packaging like that, especially when you have a potential problem with anywhere from 5 to 15% of your packaging, is it's kind of crazy. You wouldn't find that in any other type of product, especially food product. So the thing is that cork is a natural product, and it's something, it comes from a tree. It's harvested, and it's regulated how it's harvested and where it's grown. Typically grown in Mediterranean countries. Portugal, Spain, for instance, have especially Portugal, big cork tree growing production area. But years ago, especially kind of mid 90s, beginning of the sort of 2000s, we started seeing two things kind of happening. One was a major ramp up in wine production around the world, especially in places like Australia and New Zealand. And two, because there was such a need for more bottles to be used for wine, and there was a need for more corks. And so we started seeing a degradation in cork quality because they had to produce so much more. At the same time, there was all this really interesting stuff going on in Portugal. Politics, we'll sort of leave that aside for now. But the cork production industry itself really struggled. And and there are lots of different reasons for that, in terms of a lot of people. You had small farmers and big corporations, that kind of story. But you had this decrease in cork quality, and you had more people producing wine around the world. So one of the places that was really experiencing a problem with flaws in cork, mainly 2,4,6-trichloroanisole, or TCA for short, which is that compound in a cork that makes the wine smell sort of moldy, like a wet cardboard box. TCA.
That gets everywhere, right? I mean, once it gets in,
you can find it in baby carrots.
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. Yeah.
So producers in New Zealand and Australia were kind of getting the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, in terms of cork production. And they started seeing a huge increase in the number of faulty wines, and consumers complaining about those wines, because also they, especially in New Zealand, you had all those really clean, pure, very fruit-driven Sauvignon Blancs. So it was really apparent that the wines were flawed because of the closure. And so you had a big movement in New Zealand saying, we are only going to use screw caps. And the entire industry really moved to screw caps. And you had a lot of people in supermarkets in Europe, for instance, who were also saying, we don't want to have these closure problems. We just want screw caps on our wine. So that was Europe. But over in the US, of course, if you think about the tradition of screw cap versus cork in the US, where did you find screw caps? Well, you found it on Thunderbird or really inexpensive, cheap wine, Boone's Farm. That was my first wine experience.
No one on this call knows anything about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so reputation wise, people thought, I don't want a screw cap on my wine because it really means that it's a low quality product. But these days, what we now find, so there's all this back and forth, the cork team, the screw cap team. You had Randall Graham had a funeral for the cork through Grand Central Station at one point. You had a lot of plastic plugs, really cheap plastic plugs.
Yes, those synthetic things. Yeah.
People couldn't get those back in the wine bottle when they
I know.
wine, so they hated those. So you have all this going on, and finally, I would say today, what we have is a situation where you have better quality cork, better cleaning methods, and you have better quality synthetic closures that are actually these days, if you think about the Noma Corks, which is a company that's based here in North Carolina, those are actually now made from plant-based materials. And then you've got screw caps, which are better quality. And really,
and I've actually, Shari, been seeing more glass closures too. A lot of rosés I see now have glass closures.
Yep, there are those as well. And really, to me, it's about what is the winemaker's intention? What does the winemaker want you to open up and drink? And I think you can have a great wine under screw cap. You can have a great wine under cork. To me, it is not a sign of anything meaning low quality at all. And I am perfectly happy to open anything and everything. But I think these days you've got great wines under everything, and it's really up to the winemaker how they want to bottle that wine.
Thank you. I'm going to record that and just play that on my iPhone to anyone who has pushback for anti anything but cork closure. Now I have to say, let me just make sure I'm looking at this correctly, because there's a penalty drink. Mary Beth deserves a penalty drink because I'm looking here, and she said she wasn't paying attention and cut the top off the metal cap, which is, hey, listen, man, if that's the
I've seen people do that.
That's awesome. That's great. And then, of course, that opened up Pandora's box of everyone's worst hangovers on cheap wines, which is just phenomenal. Riuniti Sunny Apple. This is from the same man, by the way, who won an auction lot, 5 or 6 years ago. And my wife and I were fortunate enough to go with he and his wife out to Santa Barbara for a special wine weekend. And we ended up being able to hang out with the guys from the Hitching Post. And he was quick to remind me just now that they actually make a really awesome Merlot. So there you go to Sideways. But Kelly has a question here that says that deep divot on the bottle, the bottom of the bottle, which I typically associate with like champagne or a wine that's under some pressure that has that's some kind of window in the quality of the wine. I haven't heard that, but
I have actually no. I've been asked that before. I would say in general, it's more of an indication of the price of the glass, and so that you're going to have a more expensive bottle. And therefore you probably are going to have a more expensive wine, not necessarily a better quality wine, but probably you're paying a little bit more for the glass there. And sometimes, yes, it'll be a more expensive, higher quality wine, but not always. I wouldn't pick a wine based solely on that. Right. And in terms of screw caps, it used to be that that anything you wanted to really age, that you wanted to, and yes, the punt does have something to do. A lot of times, that's if you think about the sediment ages, it makes it easier for pouring for soms. But if you wanted to lay anything down for aging, then a cork was important. In some way, this is a little bit of a trickier question to answer. Screw caps are basically an anaerobic environment, and so the wine in some ways is preserved, and so it stays younger longer. If you have ever had Hunter Valley Semillon or Clare Valley Riesling, two Australian white wines, those are wines that are typically bottled under screw cap and unbelievably age worthy. I actually I have a case of Hunter Valley Semillon that is in my cellar right now that I'm trying desperately not to touch because I can age it for 10 years and it's going to be absolutely beautiful when I open that up. And so it will develop actually over time. The wine will change under the screw cap, but it's a kind of a different aging process. But I'm perfectly happy to age that wine under screw cap. The thing is, I don't actually have to keep it on its side. The purpose of keeping it on its side when you're aging a wine under cork is that you need to keep that cork moist.
Ah, look at that. Look at that.
You want to try that.
That's
but if you've got Madeira, old Madeira, don't keep that on its side because the wine is so acidic that it'll deteriorate the cork.
Yeah. Good. Man, that's great stuff. Good stuff. Which is the perfect segue into the next segment of the show, which is Ask the Master of Wine. So Shari, I had some questions beforehand, and
Sure.
One of the things that keeps coming up is what are some of the tricks and not tricks, that's not true, the skills that you've honed over the years tasting these thousands and thousands of wines that you can impart on regular home wine, people just enjoying wine in terms of how to taste and think about wine, without being too serious. But what are some things that we should be doing that we're not doing that might enhance the overall experience when we're enjoying a glass of wine?
So I'd say probably the number one thing is I'm a big fan of a systematic approach to tasting, meaning that when you're tasting a wine, kind of each time, that you're doing it in sort of the same order. So you're thinking about it in a pretty set format. So you're thinking about, what does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And then each of those different things, you are thinking about a couple different aspects of the wine within those. And you're doing that pretty much every single time you have a wine glass in your hand. And I think as you do that, you start to build up your frame of reference, because there are a couple things. First of all, most great tasters are not born, they are made. And it's just like any kind of, an athlete practicing over and over and over for free throws. It is practicing tasting, and it's practicing and kind of building that library in your head in terms of if you think about these three wines, each one had a little bit of a different body. It had slightly different levels of acidity, different levels of alcohol, different levels of tannin. And then the finish, if you think about the finish, the integration, the balance, the finesse, the length, those are all kind of different. And maybe they're all sort of medium minus, medium plus, maybe full.
And those are descriptors that you use when you're doing analysis on wines, right? Because I've heard that, like when I'm watching those Somm documentaries, when they say medium plus, medium minus, that's your vocabulary for how you're grading things.
Yep. And so, and it can be as simple as low, medium, high. But to do that kind of over and over and over, even if you're just doing it in your head, a lot of people will, write it down. And I have notebooks back on the bookshelf behind me of tasting notes and things like that going back years. I was actually joking with my husband today because we were doing some cleaning out of the garage, and I still have a huge file cabinet with a lot of my wine notes that go back to 1999 and 2000.
Oh, cool.
Which is terrible. Really
don't call the fire marshal.
Exactly. But really, it is kind of that that repetition and thinking through those things. And then the other thing is one of the questions I get asked a lot is how do you come up with those aromas, those flavor
Yeah.
descriptors? You know, where do you get that? And I think we've gotten better about that as a country, as a as a group of people, because I think people are more used to buying things locally,
Yeah.
things that are in season. But if you think about the smell of, it's strawberry season right here in North Carolina right now. We've just had amazing weather, and the strawberry crop has been phenomenal. This year in particular, it's great because
Yeah.
last year was really rainy. But fresh, just picked strawberries from the farmer's market smell completely differently from strawberries that I buy in the supermarket that have been on a truck for
Yeah.
weeks and basically
Sure.
have no aroma. And so if you can do more to smell your food and taste your food and really think about those different aromas and flavors, that helps you build your vocabulary.
Yeah.
And one thing that we used to do is to play around too with you can take vodka and take a neutral white wine, add a little bit of vodka to it to add
Mhm.
to see what a difference in alcohol does to it.
Right.
Add some simple syrup so that you're tasting sweetness. You could add lemon juice or citric acid, make it more acidic. So you can doctor a neutral base wine, like something like a really
Pinot
inexpensive
Grigio or something like that. Yeah.
What? Yep.
Like Pinot
And
Grigio. Yeah.
yep, exactly. And doctor it a little bit. And then you can sort of start to see, because everybody does have kind of slightly different sensitivity levels
Yeah.
to different things. And so you can start to figure out your kind of your sensitivity levels to acidity and alcohol and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great stuff. I love that. I love that. I hope everyone's jotting that down because that's a great exercise. I mean, it's not like, I mean, there are some of those kits that you can buy, but that's a great thing you could do on a
You can just do it at home.
Tuesday night. I mean, it's easy. I have to say, quick sidebar,
Yeah.
and of course, I'm trying to dig through the Freudian part of this conversation, but I noticed that your analogy was free throws. So,
Yeah.
am I correct that you worked like the ticket office at Duke for the basketball? Like, you ever been on that court and shot free throws? You ever played? I mean, like,
Yes.
come on,
Yes.
give us some
So,
Duke dirt.
Yes, I was the student in charge of all student admission to Duke basketball games my senior year in college. So I was the one they called the headline monitor. That is my true claim to fame in life. That is what will go on my gravestone. Because my other claim to fame within that realm is that prior to my taking over, we used stamps, ink stamps
Yeah.
for students as that was sort of your ticket to entry. And people used to get a stamp on their hand and then like lick it and then transfer it to another student. And so I introduced the use of wristbands for student admission to basketball games. And now if you watch a Duke basketball game and you see the students hold their arms up, you'll still see those wristbands. And I'm always like, oh, that was my idea. It's my true claim to fame. Forget anyone.
I'm assuming you were deadly serious when you held that position.
Yes, I was. I was very, very serious about it.
I bet. That's awesome. Well, Tiffany just chimed in to say that she's a Carolina grad.
Oh, there you go.
She's not going to hold that against you.
So I live down the road basically from UNC, and one of my best friends is a UNC grad. So I'm sorry, there's nothing like the Duke UNC rivalry. I know you guys have rivalries in Alabama too, but still.
Well, don't assume that everyone on the call is locked into that Alabama rivalry. We can appreciate it, but but it there's no question that Duke, all those rivalries are really pretty unique around basketball in that little triangle there.
Yeah.
The other thing go ahead. Say that.
I just said I miss sports. This is one of the things about this time right now that's I don't know. We're all watching The Last Dance, right? So
yeah. Oh, I mean, I keep checking my laptop to see when they're dropping the next 2 episodes.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
great.
It's phenomenal. It's good stuff. I agree. I'm not gonna. We won't get. Thanks, Dan. You got to throw that in, don't you? Oh goodness. Look, you give a guy a glass of wine, and it starts to flow. Um,
I did see another question on here about the best way to preserve a bottle of wine. That's
yeah,
always a good question. And I did laugh too because somebody said, "Who keeps wine for 2 days?" I assume you mean 2 hours. That I feel you. So there are a couple of different things. There's everything from the the little vacuum stoppers that you can pump the air out, and I will use those from time to time. A lot of times I'll do that and then put the wine in the fridge.
yeah,
There's also a new product out on the relatively new on the market called it's spelled re-pour, although I think they
yeah,
pronounce it rapport. Have
yeah.
you tried
Bart
those?
Fisk just said report.
Yeah.
He recommended that. Yep.
So when I was doing a little bit of work with consulting work with Nomacorp a year or so ago, they're the ones who make the plant-based
Yep.
synthetic closures. Um, they have a lab, and they actually did some testing on the rapports in terms of the level of oxygen that those let in over a certain amount of time, and their lab found those to be really successful. So the problem that I have with those is that they they're what you have to kind of do with that if you look them up on the web is if you've got leftover wine, you can use it on that, but then you kind of want to transfer it to another bottle because
Yeah.
it lasts for 30 days and you don't
Right.
want to waste it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
but I do
And
recommend those.
this is a good point, Shari, to kind of pick your brain on. Obviously wines that are higher in acidity are probably going to last a little bit longer, but nothing like the cool of the refrigerator to slow down oxidation, right? And in fact, we talked about this last night with some of those Bordeaux's because they were 2016s, 2015s, 2017s. I chucked them in the refrigerator. They might be a little bit better tomorrow or even Sunday or tomorrow once they come back to room temperature. But sometimes having a little bit of that interaction with oxygen and opening up a little bit might actually improve the wine a day later, right?
Yes, and especially that 16 it's such a phenomenal vintage in Bordeaux. I have been buying up as much as I can.
Yeah, the
For it.
acidity of that one, by the way, like blew my face off. But you could because we had the same Fougère, Captain Fougère 15 and 16 next to each other. 15 was delicious last night. It was yummy, but the 16 was kind of young and racy, kind of like Walter Payton in high school. You knew that he was going to be in the Hall of Fame someday. But yeah, that 16 was dynamite.
Yep. No, it's a great vintage. 18 is they're very excited too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because I get those questions all the time, and yeah, we laugh about the fact that who leaves wine open, but there are times on those rare occasions where you don't want to, or you can't, or don't want to finish a wine, and chilling it down in the refrigerator is a good way to kind of preserve it for later use. But yeah, seems like there are so many things out there on the market now that kind of can help preserve those things.
Yep.
The another question I wanted to ask Shari real quick, and then we'll finish up. But this is one of those things that I heard from other folks, but is also something that has occurred to me a few times, which is, and we heard this. I heard this again last night when we were talking about Chateau Angelou, and which is kind of a wonky Bordeaux thing. But what came up was the wines they made in the 80s were a much different style than they make now. And even though the wines they make now are worthy of aging, they're making styles that are more drinkable sooner. That's a very unique wine that most of us will never drink. But I feel like I'm hearing more about that these days, where a wine style is more ready to drink sooner. The question is, what's happening in the vineyards? What's happening in the winery to make a wine more drinkable now or more approachable now than it would be otherwise?
Right. Well, and it's a great question. There are a couple of different reasons for that. First and foremost, our ability to forecast the weather, because a lot of wines, a lot of grapes were harvested in Bordeaux um, earlier than they are now. So it used to be back in the day, hundreds of years ago,
Yeah.
or even 30, 40 years ago, grapes had to be harvested. They had to be brought in at an earlier point than they are today because we have much better technology. Bordeaux, unlike Napa, why you see much more vintage variation in Bordeaux compared to
Yeah.
Napa is
Right.
that the rains in Bordeaux typically come right around the harvest time, so in the
Yeah.
fall,
Gotcha.
which you don't typically get in Napa. And so grape growers would have part of actually their insurance policy, why you see a lot of different grapes and why Bordeaux is typically a blend. Part of that was an insurance policy because some grapes ripened earlier than
Yeah.
others. So Merlot, for
Right.
instance, ripened a bit earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon. And so you could bring in grapes at different points in time. But what that also meant is if you were harvesting a little on the early side, you typically had more acid and less sugar in the wine. So you had lower alcohol levels, and the wines typically were very tight and very acidic in their youth. And so they really did need time for the tannins to soften and evolve. So now there are a lot of different things also at play in terms of technology and better improvements in the winery in terms of
Hmm.
handling of grapes, in terms of grape processing. And so the wines are made while some are still making them in the same way that they have been. You really do have a lot better hygiene and technology in the winery. And we have a
Yeah.
much better understanding of the fermentation process and malolactic fermentation as well. And so winery sanitation and hygiene is actually something that's it plays a huge role. It's kind of the quality control, quality assurance when it comes to wineries and winemaking is something. It's a topic that is not at all very sexy, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's very important.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Well, listen, I personally thank you. I'm sure if everyone could clap for you right now, they would. It's been phenomenal having you on this, and I can see people clapping all around. Shari, thank you. As I said in the beginning, your whole approach is so laid back, and you just make it easy to for people to interact with you. The final question that a number of folks had asked is in terms of value, for Tuesday night wines, where are two or a region for white, or region for red that's often overlooked that we as regular consumers might want to put on our radar screens?
Let's see. So, couple different things. I am a huge fan of the wines from Sicily,
Right?
especially
Is that a
the
Neradivola?
Norello Mascalese from Etna
Gotcha.
is one of my favorites. And so I buy a lot of those. The Passo Rosso is one that I'm a particularly big fan of from Passo Peschiaro. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a bunch of things that we've purchased or that I've purchased recently. Um, I we typically, I mean, we drink a lot of wine with dinner, and so
Yeah.
I'm usually looking for things that are very food friendly. So I do buy a lot of Italian wines.
Right.
I just bought a Perone Barbera today that's like $14.99. So I think that's a great little value buy. Let's see what else. If you come across, I noticed you were doing Chardonnay, and I was gonna put in a little plug for the Lioco Chardonnay. Have you had
Yeah.
that one?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Not a
that's a
lot of
great one.
not a lot of
Absolutely.
oak and very food friendly. So I like that. So I still think that there are really good values, and I think there will be a lot more good values coming out of California
Yeah.
over the next few years. Still a lot of people making some just really terrific wines. And then let's see, I'm trying to think what other kind of interesting things. I really do think, you had one tonight. Spain makes some amazing wines, and they
Yeah.
have kind of a new generation of growers there, who are just doing some amazing things. We have a couple young MWs, recent passes. Fernando Moro is one. And I mean, they are just doing some great stuff with old vine, Garnacha, and with
Yeah.
Tempranillo, and just there is such a vibrancy to that community right now. It's really an exciting place. We drink a lot of Spanish wines here too. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
Australia. I mean, Australia has undergone another renaissance, and
Yep.
I think they've backed off a lot of the really big alcoholic oaky style wines that they were doing for a long time. A lot of the crazy critter wines that were really inexpensive and a little bit on the sweet side.
Crazy critters.
And you still do see some really great values, but also there's just some really beautiful Shiraz coming out
Yeah.
of Hunter or Claire, and just some really elegant wines. Clonakilla is I'm a big fan of their sort of more affordable. They have a really
Yeah.
high end Shiraz, and then they've got a more affordable version. I think that's a really great wine. Just a lot of really terrific values there.
Yeah. Yeah. Shari, oh gosh, we could go on more and more, but it's almost 10 o'clock your time. Thank you so
My
much for
pleasure.
being so gracious with your time.
Well, thanks for having
And
me.
we're gonna have we're gonna tackle Italy. I'd say candidly, of all the regions, to me, I mean, Portugal is tough
Oh, that's
because the words are hard.
Portugal. But wait, Portugal's another place I love, and they're producing some amazing wines.
Yeah.
And also,
Oh, I
if
agree.
you're looking for your next trip, Lisbon is
Yes.
phenomenal. So
Yeah, absolutely. We did Portuguese wines a couple of weeks ago,
mhm.
and yeah, I agree. The Portuguese is just hard, but Italy as a region, to me, wow, there's just so much to learn. I mean, you've got all the stuff that's going on in the north, on the east and west of the north. You've got that central area. Then you go low, and like you said, Sicily. We have a friend that's been quarantined in Sicily for 53 days now by herself. But she's got on her Instagram feed, she just keeps, posting and writing about, the wines that she's having and the food that she's having. Just gorgeous there, and the wines, who knew? But all that to say, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having you on tonight's tasting, and I hope our paths cross again soon. But
Yeah.
I know everyone has been really had a blast tonight. So thanks so much, and thanks for everyone for hanging around a little bit longer. It was great to have this access to Shari and dive a little bit deeper into it. And hopefully, I'll see a lot of you guys back in a couple of weeks for our next one. And I hope you guys have a great, wonderful rest of the weekend. So see you guys soon.
Thank you. Everybody
Bye.
stay safe and healthy.